China is facing widespread condemnation following a BBC report about the mass rape and sexual torture of Uyghur women and other Muslims detained in the province of Xinjiang. Several former prisoners spoke on camera to the BBC's Matthew Hill. A warning to our audience, these clips contain disturbing descriptions of sexual abuse.
Tassanai Zaiwudan is reliving a story she can barely bring herself to tell. She was held at one of Xinjiang's so-called re-education camps. These satellite images show the site where Tassanai says she was held, sharing a cell with 13 other women with a bucket for a toilet. And she's haunted by one image, masked men coming down a camp corridor like this one after midnight.
They were 3 men, not one, but 3. They did whatever evil their mind could think of, and they didn't spare any part of my body, biting it to the extent that it was disgusting to look at. They didn't just rape, they were barbaric. They had bitten all over my body.
By the BBC, talked about the mass rapes of detained women in Xinjiang province.
Many former camp inmates flee to Istanbul. Some talk of having to choose between punishment or being complicit in these crimes.
I worked 6 months as a cleaning worker for the women. Han Chinese men would pay money to have their pick of the pretty young inmates.
This was the first time Gulzira has told anyone the full extent of what she says she was forced to do.
My job is to remove their clothes and then handcuff them on their beds so they cannot move.
China claimed the BBC report was, quote, wholly without factual basis. Meanwhile, the Intercept has obtained a massive police surveillance database used by the Chinese government to monitor residents of Xinjiang. The database confirms China collects millions of text messages, phone contacts, and call records, as well as biometric data from Muslim minorities in Xinjiang. Information collected is used to decide who to detain. China has admitted it runs a series of what it calls free vocational training centers, but critics have likened them to internment camps. In January, the outgoing Trump administration accused China of carrying out genocide and halted the importation of cotton and tomatoes from Xinjiang. President Joe Biden's Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, has agreed with that assessment. To talk more about the crackdown in Xinjiang, we're joined by 2 guests. Abduweli Ayup is a Uyghur linguist and poet. He was detained for 15 months for running a Uyghur-language kindergarten in Xinjiang. He's joining us from Bergen in Norway. And joining us from Seattle, Washington, Darren Byler is with us, an anthropologist at the University of Colorado Boulder. He's the author of 2 forthcoming books, one on Uyghurs and one on technologies of re-education in China and around the world. Darren Byler, if we could begin with you. This massive database that has been unveiled as China refuses to admit this total surveillance state for the Muslim minority, the Uyghurs, in Xinjiang. Explain what we have learned and how they're surveilling the population.
Well, great. It's an honor to be here. The database that we've uncovered through the work done at the Intercept is 52 gigabytes of thousands of internal police documents coming from the city of Urumqi. They're dated 2017 to 2019. And what they show us at a granular level is the way that Muslim institutions, the mosques, the family structure is being targeted by a surveillance regime and an accompanying police force. Religious activity has almost ground to a halt completely. There's several, in one report that said 160 elderly people still go to the mosque, but 80,000 others have stopped attending. They also talk about families being visited by government officials and being placed on watch lists, particularly the families of people that have been sent to the camps. And it's giving us really granular level view of communities that have really been torn apart, of people that have been sent to these camps. It ranges from 10% of the population to higher. It's a really devastating material that's showing us the extent of the damage, the way that this entire society is being targeted with a program of elimination and some forms of replacement, a kind of colonial regime.
And Abduweli Ayup, one of the most disturbing revelations in this BBC report about the torture and sexual abuse of detainees in these internment camps in Xinjiang is that Uyghur detainees themselves, as we just heard in the clip we played, that detainees themselves were forced to play a role in the mass rapes. Now, you were arrested and held for 15 months between 2013 and 2014. Could you explain what you witnessed and what you were accused of, why you were arrested?
I was arrested because I had the mother language kindergarten in Kashgar first, and then our capital city, Urumqi. And because of my mother language kindergarten, I was arrested and then detained 15 months. And during the time, I faced a very incredible situation, very brutal, and it's rape. And second, it's disturbing and very devastating is torture with the electric shock and with the humiliation, with the denounce of the religion and the denounce of the identity. For example, that during that time in the Spring Festival, Chinese Spring Festival, we have to eat the dumpling. At that time, I suspect what is inside, and I asked, it's halal or haram, that thing, and then I was punished. I was chained in 7 days. I think it's what's happening there is inhuman, and the target is the Uyghur, and because of their religion and because of their culture. And the government, the mainly purpose is force them to denounce the religion, force them to denounce the language and the cultural practice.
Darren, could you talk about the fact that the Chinese government has been accused both of committing cultural genocide, but also profiting from the forced labor of Muslim minority communities? Talk about the connection between forced labor connected to Western supply chains and consumers, particularly in Xinjiang's role of producing over 80% of China's cotton, and also the region being rich in other natural resources, as you said earlier, including natural gas and oil.
Now, we have to go back to the 1990s and 2000s, which is when China was opening up to the West, was becoming a manufacturer for the world, and had a real need to obtain raw materials like oil, natural gas, cotton, and eventually tomatoes from this region. And the Uyghur region, which is immense, it's the size of Alaska, has around 20% of Chinese oil and natural gas. And so in the 90s and 2000s, they began to send settlers into the Uyghur majority areas in the south part of the region to begin to extract those resources. And so there you're kind of seeing a sort of classic internal colony that's being used by the nation. Over time, an antagonism really developed between the local population, this indigenous native Uyghur population in southern Xinjiang, between them and those settlers. Because the settlers began to take over the institutions, the cost of living began to rise, and so there was protests over land being taken. There was police brutality in response to those protests, and then there was more protests, and it turned into a sort of a cycle of violence. In the 2000s, a rhetoric of terrorism entered the discussion following 9/11 here in the U.S., and that was then attached to this Uyghur population. because they're Muslim. Although most of the conflict really had nothing to do with their religious practice, it was about injustice. That's how it was framed. Moving forward into the present, as this camp system has been built out as a way of targeting and really transforming the population, who they feel like in order to integrate them, they need to retrain them to teach them not to practice Islam and to speak Chinese. That program has now been accompanied by a factory regime that takes advantage of the industrial scale agriculture that's been developed along with the settlement of southern Xinjiang, and begins to produce textiles for the world. 25% or so of cotton comes from China. So it means that it's very difficult to buy products that don't have this cotton in them. Sometimes it's just simply grown in the region, and other times it's now actually being, the final product is being produced in the region. The factories themselves are associated with the camps, or in some cases they're nearby the camps. The workers that are sent into these spaces have no choice but to go. If they refuse, they're labeled extremists and then can be sent to the camps. And so the threat of the camp is really holding people in place, along with all of the surveillance systems that are also monitoring all of their movements.
Professor Byler, you wrote a piece in The Guardian headlined, "Why are U.S. companies buying tech from Chinese firms that spy on Muslims?" Can you name the companies that are involved?
I can't name all of them. There's around 1,400 firms that are working in Xinjiang to build a kind of digital enclosure system. They have different tasks within that system. But I'll name a few. The largest companies in China, what they call the AI champions, national champions, are deeply invested in this situation. They're the camera companies, the software companies. Hikvision and Dahua are two of the largest camera manufacturers in the world. And the op-ed you mentioned talks about one of them, how Amazon and IBM were buying these cameras from one of these companies in order to begin to track coronavirus here in the U.S. Other companies like SenseTime, MugV, E2, which are these artificial intelligence companies, and also now sometimes building cameras, are also involved in this situation. And they're making component parts of things you might buy, many of them made in China. So, for instance, MugV is also partnered with a cell phone company to do the face recognition camera or the phone access system. You know how you can scan your face and then it opens the phone for you. So there's lots of applications that come out of the surveillance systems that are built in Xinjiang and then become these other products in other locations. And so we have to be really careful if we want to be ethical consumers in being sure that the companies we're buying things from are not also participating in this sort of genocidal violence in northwest China.
Abduweli, you are working on writing a memoir of your time in prison. Could you tell us a little bit about that? What is it that you document about your experience in the prisons? What conditions were like there? Whether you were able to speak to other prisoners while you were there? And what you witnessed and learned about what had been happening and what continues to happen in these camps?
Yes, I almost finished my book, Prisoners Made in China. And because I stayed in Kashgar detention center and then in Urumqi, 3 different detention centers. So I'm very familiar with those detention center and detention system. And in my book, I talked about what kind of torture in interrogation room. Second is what was happening in the cell. And the third is what's the torturing methods in the cell, and what's the guard's method to force prisoners to confess, and how the system work in detention center. And I describe as a prisoner's perspective, and I describe it from the beginning to the end, that 15 months. And especially I focus on the guards and prisoners' relationship, and the guards and the interrogation. For example, I can make you one example that guards there, they help the interrogation, because if there's a competition between the interrogators and the guards, and if the guard get that confess, and he will be promoted. If the interrogator get the confess, that one have promotion more. In that case, the two kind of guys are competing to force prisoners to confess. And in my book, I describe it this. For example, that prison guards, they use hashish, and they use heroin, and they use sexual abuse to confess, force prisoners confess, to tell what they want. Because in detention system, the guards and the interrogators, they mainly focus on confession, because they want the people who are living there to tell that we are criminals, we are sick, and we are problem makers. They want that answer. They don't want any detail. They want, yes, they force the people to answer the question yes or no. The story is already made up. Only the game is playing there is yes or no.
Abduweli, if you can tell us how you ultimately left Xinjiang, how you got out of the country, we're talking to you in Norway now, what has happened to your family, and how they use cell phones integral to monitoring everything people do, gathering information from those phones, requiring that you have them.
Yes, after I released from the camp, I faced a big problem that I have to keep my cell phone on 24 hours. And if I visit my friend, and because we are together, and I was already blacklisted, and my friend become blacklisted person. In that case, my friend was in danger. So I lived in that surveillance system, and it's not possible to me to live further. That's why I faced escape. I escaped the country because of this, because of the surveillance.
And Abduweli, in addition to the surveillance that's carried out on Uyghurs in China, there have been reports that the Chinese government is also tracking Uyghurs living outside. Are you concerned about your own safety? And do you still have family in Xinjiang or anywhere else in China?
Yes, still we are in free world, but we are under the pressure. For example, I went to Chinese embassy in 2016, September. At the time, the Chinese embassy in Ankara asked me to add the WeChat, to download WeChat and add them. After that, the Chinese state security in Urumqi called me immediately. We are here watching you, and what are you doing and what are you working on? We know clearly. So you should listen to us. We reach you wherever you are. It's a psychological pressure. It's only me. Like I'm living in Bergen right now, and I know we have around 200 Uyghurs and about 20 Uyghurs called by Chinese embassy in Oslo. So we are in free world, but we are under pressure right now.